Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Calderon Muñiz.
All right, welcome back, guys. We're rolling along. Like we're moving out of section 7 into section 8. At this point, we are technically halfway through the AAMC outline in terms of the number of sections. But to be completely honest, like the first 4 sections are by far the most complex. And so we're going to start moving a lot quicker as we move into this more sociology side of things. But there's still a lot of like really interesting stuff just kind of overall. I know the last couple of weeks we've been talking about like, why do we act the way we act with like, conditioning, both operant and classical, and kind of like understanding motivations and that side of thing. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about like just what you think about yourself and your like self, like what's going on with that. And we're going to talk a little bit bigger picture about like morality overall and how like a person can like identify where they're at and what's the right thing to do, which is obviously a super interesting thing, right? Like, a quick discussion of what is ethics, right? Like that's what we're going to do here of just trying to understand that. Okay, we're not going to cover everything with ethics, but we're going to cover specifically some of the stuff that the MCAT's going to test on it. So jumping right in, what do we think about ourselves? What's going on with this? There's a whole lot of terms that are related to self. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to hit some of those, not all of them, but some of them, because there's some other things in other sections that we will be hitting like at other times. But here in this section with 8A, there's some terms that we really specifically need to spend some time discussing. For example, we'll start off with self-concept and self-identity. I think for a lot of people, those are like the same thing, right? Like, what is your self-concept? What's your self-identity? And so I think it's really important to be able to pull these apart because you're likely to see both of them as answer choices on test day. So you need to be able to tell what's the difference between these. So your self-concept is everything you think about yourself, like everything. Like, what is your concept of self overall? Your self-concept is not something you can really explain because it's too big, right? Like Azaii, quickly tell me everything about yourself, right? Like that's not something you can do, right? Like it's just way too big. Versus self-identity is more about how do you identify, right? Like what groups do you put yourself in? And that's a little bit less complex, right? So the self-concept is more complex, right? The self-identity is like, how do you identify? Like, I am a teacher who lives in Missouri, grew up on a farm. And so like, kind of like big picture, kind of like, fitting in within these different niches versus and like, in order to tell you about my self-concept, I have to tell you about literally everything. Like, what's my opinion on sweet pickles versus dill pickles, right? Like I have to like everything about me. And that's like not actually communicatable because it's just too big.
Sweet pickles are a thing.
Yeah, they're inferior though.
Okay. Yeah. So what's interesting is, as you mentioned that a couple of podcasts ago, you guys will remember that we had a very special guest. And so Nicole is with us and we were talking also a little bit about interviews. And there's like, as you were talking about self-concept, Phil, I just thought of tell me about yourself. Like that is the question everyone gets on interviews or during interviews. And it's like, you never know where to start because there's always so much, right? So that's one of those questions people tell you, like prep in advance for. But what's interesting is what you end up telling them really is just like the condensed version of like how you identify, right? Like, okay, I am like, this is my background. This is what I studied. This is what I do. This is like, why I'm here, right? So it's interesting because that's like probably why that question is so tough to answer, but also why it might be so revealing during interviews. I
like that you're thinking about that. That's a very practical thing of like, like thinking about interviews, like tell me about yourself. Exactly. Also, if somebody asks that, don't start with classifying and like ranking your pickle preferences. That's they're not looking for your self-concept. Your self-identity is what they're looking for.
What's interesting? I think if like I were interviewing someone and I said, oh, tell me about yourself. And they started with, well, I have this really hot take and it's about pickles. I would be intrigued.
Yeah, I'd definitely be interested. Right.
Yeah, maybe not for med school apps, but it's definitely, yeah.
I like that idea. I kind of want to test that out next time somebody asks me, like, tell me about yourself. Like, well, here's how I feel about pickles. And I'll rank them for you. And like, I feel like I'm going to come away very strange, but memorable if that's my goal.
That's very true. If anyone tries that before we get to, let us know. I'm very curious. um, kind of the idea of self-identity, like you said, is like how we identify, but we can also ascribe ourselves value, right? So not just like, okay, this is who we are, but this is kind of our worth. And that's what a lot of people know as self-esteem, right? So this is a term that, we are fairly familiar with colloquially and like in our everyday lives. Like, how do you feel about yourself? Do you think that you are good at like doing something? Are you smart? Like just kind of these categorical value-based descriptors. But that's different than believing that you're actually capable of doing something, right? And so that is better classified by self-efficacy. And so I might think that I'm an okay student, right? But I might think that I cannot do well on a physics exam. So my confidence in my ability to do this particular task, to sit down and answer, 20 questions about physics at a college level is low, even though I might think I am otherwise a good student. So self-efficacy, I also think of it as more specific, more task-oriented, narrower in its focus. So right now, right, so far, keeping track of what we've talked about self-concept, right? All that you think about yourself. We've talked about self-identity, how you identify, how you perceive yourself in that sense. We have self-esteem, kind of this value-based system, and then efficacy in terms of your capacity to execute something.
Yeah. So like self-esteem, I always just say like, do you like yourself? Like that's really what self-esteem is, like yay, nay, somewhere in between. Self-efficacy, So I always want to be really careful here because self-efficacy is not how capable are you, but it's how capable do you think you are. And those don't always line up. Like there are people like the example you said, like, oh, like, I feel like I'm bad at physics. You might be great at physics, in which case your self-efficacy is lower than your actual like ability. If anything, my problem is the other direction. I have probably too high of self-efficacy. I feel capable. Like put me in a scenario, I'll figure my way through it. Which is why, like, when I went to med school, I'm like, oh, like I'll buy this like 7-bedroom, like decrepit mansion with like holes in the roof, and I'll fix it up while I'm in med school. No problem. I can do that. I'm like, okay, that was probably like overestimating my abilities of, being able to put things together. But like, I actually think that just personally, self-efficacy, mine is so high because I grew up on a farm, and like, you can't ever have somebody, like if something goes wrong, you got to fix it. Right. It's not like you don't call somebody. Right. So I remember like being 12 and like the cows got out, got to go corral the cows. I'm like, I don't know how to do this. I'll figure it out. And then I'll fix the fence with some boards that I find around, and like, okay, I did it. Right. And so like eventually you do that enough and you start to be like, oh, I can tackle any task that I, even if I'm over my head. And so I think that that's just kind of a weird thing with myself, that my self-efficacy is so high, which is why I put myself over my head so often. And I kind of like it because I like to put myself over my head and then grow to that position. And so I like to learn. I like to be over my head and then figure out how to make this work. So this is like the self-efficacy. I really want to like hammer home this idea of it's not necessarily how capable you are. It's how capable do you think you are? Do you think you can handle this? Do you think you can't handle this? It's possible, like obviously these things are related. It's possible to have like really low self-efficacy, like, oh, I don't think I can do any of that, but I really like myself. I'm happy. And like, it's possible that these don't, like generally people think that like if one's high, the other one's high. There are possible scenarios where they don't match up, right? Like you feel like, oh, I can accomplish anything, but like, I don't really like myself. Like that would be high self-efficacy, low self-esteem. And so understanding how those things relate is important. Now, what's also interesting, this is one of my favorite terms of these, like, the self terms, like, self-concept, self-identity, self-esteem, self-efficacy. One of my favorites is the looking glass self, which basically says, so it's not just about how you see yourself, which is, how these previous things are, but it's also about how you think others see you. And that changes what you think about yourself. Now, so I always use this example of let's say you wake up in the morning and you walk downstairs and your parents are like, "Oh, you're late for school, idiot. Get out there to the bus." And you go to the bus and the bus driver's like, "Get in here, idiot." And then you go and sit down and then you go to class and the teacher calls you an idiot. You're so sad, Azaii. I can see you're that's not very nice. But if that were to occur and every day, 10 people called you an idiot, you would feel like an idiot. And that's just this interesting thing of the way you feel about yourself is being shaped on how other people are seeing you, or more specifically, how you think other people are seeing you. And I think that that's a very important detail there. So it's not just about how others see you, it's about how you think they see you. And so a lot of times, people will overestimate I think everyone was paying attention to me and judging me. And a lot of times, people aren't paying any attention at all. And let's say all of your friends think you're really smart, but you answered a question wrong in class and now you feel oh, all my friends think I'm an idiot. Right. And that you start to feel bad and feel like an idiot. And no, it's they all think you're really smart, but they just, the way they see you and the way you think they see you don't necessarily match up. And with the looking glass self, it's not about how other people see you. It's about how you think they're seeing you, which is this kind of interesting thing overall, that it's kind of about your perspective of other people's perspective, which is kind of confusing to say.
Yeah. Notice that everything that we've talked about so far is your own understanding of it, right? It's your understanding of everything about you, your understanding of who you are and whether, you're good and like yourself and, whether you think that you can actually do something, how you think other people think about you. So that's really what this section is all about. It really is the self, right? And so as long as you can follow through and say, okay, there's the I in front of it, right? I think, and then you fill in the blank. I don't know why I'm going closer that way. You fill in the blank and that will tell you, right, whether you're talking about concept, esteem, efficacy, identity, etc. And yeah, that looking glass self is so interesting because you're absolutely right. It's so moment dependent sometimes, right? That in general, your friends probably think you're an okay person. Otherwise they wouldn't be your friend. Right. Mm-hmm. But a negative experience or doing something that you think you did silly, right. Then you think they're okay, well now they're going to think I'm not smart, right. Is based off this one moment. And it's so easy to ignore all these other positive moments. But yeah, the example of having a small child, having a child just being called an idiot all day. Oh, that is heartbreaking.
Yeah. And that's a super interesting thing overall. And that's also why it's really important just generally, if you have feelings, verbalize them, especially if they're positive. A lot of times, I really like this person, but if I don't tell them, then they don't know. And maybe they're constantly worried and think that I don't like them. And
y'all, that is so true. I just want to give this little quick story time. So I was working with this pediatrician, and I won't go into specifics, right? But really first time working with this person, really awesome person. And we're having a conversation with a patient, and it's a difficult conversation. And the physician steps out to get someone that came with the patient. And, I said something to the patient. I was oh yeah, they really mean what they're saying. And the physician would say something, saying something positive to the patient. Patient was oh yeah, that's my guy. And I don't think they had ever expressed that to the physician before, because when I mentioned it to the physician, they seemed touched and surprised. Mm-hmm. And so, this is someone who otherwise seems a little closed off, but they had held these positive opinions about their doctor for so long, right? That's a silly example in the sense of okay, yeah, that's their doctor, whatever. But that might be someone that you're encountering every day, right? And just needs a pick me up. I had another experience with a surgeon this past weekend or past week. And I said something so stupid, y'all. I questioned why I was in medical school. I was oh, okay, this is bad. And you could just see on their face, just and I'm dang, this is, it's one of the first few times I'm working with this person. I'm this is not going to go well. But then at the end of it, we had a conversation and we had been talking some more and, they said something positive. I was wow, I really misgauged the the intensity of that moment as to how they would perceive me. Right. And so like my looking glass self in that moment was very different from reality, because yes, I did say something stupid, but like that doesn't have to have this huge impact on how other people see. Sorry, I digress. It makes me, I'm very passionate about these things.
No, that's a very interesting thing. Also, just as a side note, people tend to remember negative stuff better than they remember positive stuff. And so like, there's this one time that like my friend said something that like made me feel like they didn't like me. And I'm like, I'm going to remember that forever. And I'm like, all the stuff that was like very positive, like I didn't even think like that didn't stick with me for some reason. And so, yeah, a little bit kind of like tricky and interesting. I like your example of like, oh, I said something stupid. I feel like everyone has that time that they said something and they're like, oh, I'm such an idiot. But yeah, definitely important to kind of understand overall.
Yeah. And so stepping away from how we see ourselves, right? We said that we were going to talk on ethics. So how we see what's right and wrong, that's coming up next. So I don't know if, so basically there's this theory of moral development. So Kohlberg has this theory of moral development based off of basically different stages in your life and how you are going to perceive what morality is, what your understanding of morality is, what your understanding of right or wrong is, and ultimately decide how you're going to act based off of that. Like, is this right? Is this wrong? And so the way I like to think about this, I like to chunk it. So we normally talk about the three main stages and then like sub stages within them. But I like to think about age range, because if I can picture someone progressing through these stages in my head, it makes it a little bit easier to stick. And so let's start with Phil's example of a small kid, right? And they're getting off and going into the bus, right? So let's say that they're pre-adolescent, so they're very young. If you think about a 4-year-old, right, 3-4-year-old, what's their view of what's right or wrong? Right? They really care about two things. Am I going to get rewarded? Am I going to get something? Am I going to be, told that, like, am I going to get something good, or am I going to get in trouble? Right? Like those are really the two big things, but they start off with, I don't want to get in trouble. So, that's like, if you're talking to a 3-year-old, like that's really all they care about in this world, right? They don't want to get in trouble. And so that's the first chunk, this pre-adolescent chunk, and that's pre-conventional or pre-moral. It's before you get to the point where you really start understanding morality. And that first component, right, they don't want to get in trouble. So that's obedience versus punishment, right? Am I going to do what I'm told, or am I going to get in trouble? My goal is just to avoid punishment. That's it. Get a little bit older, next stage in that, right? Maybe I want to get something out of it. Right. So now I'm developing this like self-interest. I want something. So now I just don't want to not get in trouble, but can I get something out of it? Like that's something that's good. Right. So morality is understood in this context of, I don't want to get in trouble. And then what can I get out of it?
Yeah. There's this really interesting thing, just kind of like big picture. Like, let's say you were an alien and you could like zoom in on people's lives and you could kind of like watch what they do and the way they act. Like if you didn't speak English, you didn't understand media, you could just watch people. It would be very easy for you to come to the conclusion that this race, the human beings, they don't have morality. Right. That they don't understand right and wrong, because there are things going on in the world like stealing and like lying and stuff like this. And so it's kind of a weird thing to realize that most people at the beginning, we'd all say like just overall, like, yeah, there's right and wrong. And all of us know. But if you watch people's actions, maybe it's not quite as like homogenous where we all know right and wrong, or at least act accordingly. And I think this is what is really interesting about Kohlberg, is just kind of talking about what do you see as like the right thing for you to do in this scenario? And for kids like who are really young, they're in that pre-conventional stage. Like, I don't know if anyone's ever been around like kindergartners and you're like, Billy, why'd you hit Sally? And it's like, well, Tommy told me to, like, for some reason that makes it okay. Right. Like, and for that person, like obedience is where morality is built around. Like, am I doing what I'm told? And if I'm doing what I'm told, that's the right thing to do. And so it's like a super interesting thing. I like that you kind of like start with kids, because there is this progression. That one of the things that's really interesting about Kohlberg, though, is that not everyone progresses, and that there's this thing where, like, especially if you look at like Erikson and Freud, which, side note, are also in section 8A, but we're not going to have time to go into that in depth. It's like super complex and lots of tables. Definitely want to study it, but like we're probably not going to talk about it in the podcast. Know that we talk about it in the courses and in the classes and things like that. Free trial sessions, come to those. We'll talk about it there a little bit more in depth with like visuals. But like in those, the Erikson and Freud stuff, there's like very clear like ages where you move from one to the next. With Kohlberg, these moral stages, the idea is like everyone starts off here, and then some people move to the next stage, and then some people move to the next stage after that. And so the stage after this pre-conventional stage, where it's about like rewards, punishments, obedience, like just once more to hit on this, like, there are adults out there who like see a wallet on the sidewalk and like, all right, I'm going to take the wallet, stick the money in my wallet, and then throw the wallet back on the ground. And like, that's what they see as what they should do in that scenario. And that's because they're in this like pre-conventional morality. I know a lot of like everyone, like, okay, maybe not everyone knows people, but like I know some people who are definitely older who are in this pre-conventional morality. And it's just kind of an interesting thing kind of overall. But moving past that, we get to the conventional morality, which is where like most people end up, where it's, that's why it's called the conventional morality. And this is built around like, what does society say I should do? And what do the laws say I should do? And so in this conventional morality, that's really the concerns of like, what am I supposed to do? Like, does society frown on this? Does society like it? Are the laws for it? Are the laws against it? And so there are people out there who like say that like, I won't do drugs, or I would never murder someone because it's against the law. And like at first you're like, wait a minute, like what if that wasn't a law? Would you murder people then? Right? What if you moved to a country where they didn't have law against that? Like, where's that kind of coming from? And there's also like not to focus too much on the law side, but also like social customs, right? Like, are you doing something like, do you think this is the right thing to do because everyone just says it's the right thing to do? Like, for example, I'm like trying to think of some examples that aren't too like cutting edge here. So this kind of goes back to like the norms and like those sorts of things, that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. But like, let's say, turning back the clock, like homosexuality was no, like that's a big, like a taboo thing. And so like, if you were homosexual, like you might never act on it because maybe you were in this conventional morality of like, what do you think is the right thing to do is based on like what society says is the right thing to do. And like, I'm not trying to like make any moral judgments or anything like homosexuality is like the first example that came to my mind there, but just kind of like building your morality off of what society says or what the laws are. That's this conventional morality that most people kind of end up in.
Yeah. And like, this is, like you said, not everyone keeps progressing through these stages. So, and that inherently assigns value to each of these stages, like makes one seem better than another. Recognize that there might also be different situations that might ultimately require different types of morality.
Yeah. And so some people might be in one stage generally, but might move to another stage, like in certain scenarios.
Yeah. So with conventional morality, right, we said it really like what other people think matters, right? With so moving on to kind of the next and final general phase, that's post-conventional morality. And so in this case, we have these more abstract ideas of what morality is. It goes beyond just like laws and rules and expectations, but you really start considering other people's rights, right? And so other people's rights might actually supersede like what is considered otherwise okay. And so you have these kind of two components within that. You have this like understanding of the social context, right? Like, but you're choosing which of those principles are important to you, right? So you're going beyond just, okay, this is what is considered correct. And now you're saying which ones do I consider right morally, even if they're not legally right. And so there's that self-selection component. And then I think the one that I perhaps find most interesting, and I wouldn't be surprised if you also find it like most interesting, feels like this like universal kind of ethics, right? And so like it's always what you think is right is what's right. And it's like your individual understanding of what right is kind of the final absolute. And so what's interesting about this, and I'll try and like come up with an example we can talk through like what it might be, but patients. So patient care and the way that patient care is documented. So there's a lot of discussion about electronic medical records and taking care of patients, and meeting criteria that insurance companies are setting forth, like requirements for patient care and for how physicians can bill and how they can like get stuff for their patients. And a lot of doctors are going to find themselves in a scenario, if they have not already, which I suspect just about all of them have at some point, where what like the rights of their patients to care, to access, and what they need may not always align with what is legally required from a visit, or the expectation that is set by an insurance company or a providing system. And so this conflict of, okay, am I going to do what is considered like, legally and socially acceptable, or am I going to supersede that with like what I think might be right, even if it's different than the legal component, even if, like in that case, I'm prioritizing what I consider my patient's right over the legal system and like the other social norms. And so I won't go into like any particular, like, any judgments on what may or may not be correct, because again, this is the whole point of this conversation. Like people will be in different stages of this morality and have different perspectives, even within different scenarios. The same person might have different perspectives, but it's something to think about, and just playing with that idea of, okay, is it obedience and reward versus punishment? Is it caring about like what other people think, trying to get their approval, trying to, like just follow some laws and have that, I'm going to contribute to a stable society and law and order? Or is it, going beyond what's considered okay, and like using your like individual principles and the rights of others? Kind of the three big categories.
Yeah. I feel like this post-conventional morality can get very like messy and like a little bit tricky. And it's because like, remember, a lot of the world is in this conventional morality, right? Where like whatever the laws are, that's what the right thing is to do. And so I love that you like related this back to being a physician. Most of the examples I normally talk about with this are more kind of like outside the realm of healthcare, but there's absolutely scenarios that come up of like, let's say you have a patient who has HIV and is not disclosing it to their partner. Like that's like, you're not allowed legally to like, disclose that to people, like HIPAA violations and things like that. There's some trickiness there. Or like physician assisted suicide, or there's like some really interesting, tricky places, like not even to go into, which I think is where you were going to, like just like the way stuff is noted down, like an insurance will cover it or not cover it. And like, maybe if you like notate it just slightly differently, then all of a sudden, it's not going to be a problem. This person who needs this care will get this care. But like, maybe that's not exactly the way it happened. And so it's like, it's like really tricky, messy stuff out there. And we probably shouldn't get too deep into that, because that's a very scary, deep, murky pool where there's a lot of sharks swimming around. There's a lot of danger in that. But in like the bigger picture, just kind of like understanding this post-conventional morality, like understanding like there are times where people have done stuff that is not socially acceptable, stuff that's not good for them personally, stuff that's not like within the confines of law, like things like a sit-in, right? Like if I participate in a sit-in and I go into this building like for civil rights, like turning back the clock, like I go into a sit-in, like it's against the law. I'm going to go to jail. I'm not benefiting from this. Like society, like everyone around me in this diner is not a fan of what I'm doing. And like, I might get beaten and things like that. And so that motivation there is this post-conventional morality where it definitely isn't for your benefit. So it's not in this pre-conventional morality. It's not obedience. Like you're being told not to do this. The law says not to do it. Everyone around you is like yelling and telling you to stop doing this. And so like it's like not in these like normal realms, the pre-conventional and conventional morality, but it is, I think most people at this point would say like, yeah, that's a good thing to do. Like that in that scenario, like that's morally like commendable overall. And that's also something that's kind of tricky because understanding that the laws sometimes are slower than society's advancement. And so there's like scenarios where sometimes the right thing to do legally is not the right thing to do morally in this post-conventional morality. There's a whole lot in here, but like one of the things in this post-conventional morality is specifically this idea of social contract theory, which is the idea is like as a part of society, I am entering into a contract with society. Now this isn't a contract that I like sat down and signed one day. This is something that I sign as just like participating in society. I am in a contract with them. So within society overall, I do certain things and I expect certain things in response. And sometimes those things don't match up. Like, let's say like in my view of the world, I pay taxes, I contribute to things, but the police should take care and like, prevent like crimes and like things like that and protect people. And if you like, sometimes people feel like that contract is not being upheld, right? Like in certain like communities and things like that, you get this feeling of like, I am doing my part. But like you're not holding up your side of the contract. And there's lots of interesting cases of civil disobedience in the past. Like I think Henry David Thoreau like went to jail because he refused to pay his taxes because he felt like the government and like society was not upholding its portion of what it should be doing. And so he like went into this thing of saying like, I'm going to stop holding my end of this contract if you're not going to hold your end of this contract, and this sort of idea. Now that's a much bigger one focused specifically on like governmental stuff, but like you're in contracts with other people, like social contracts with other people in society. For example, like I don't spit on other people, right? And it's not because like, I don't want to. It's because if that's the society we all lived in, that would be a worse society to be in, where like everyone's like spitting at each other, like not even touching on disease, which is like probably not a good idea from the healthcare side of things. So as a result, like I behave and I do these things and I expect everyone else to behave as well and like do these things. And so like I'm in this contract with you and all of society where we don't go around just randomly punching each other and spitting on each other and like, like that sort of thing is just not acceptable. And so there's this idea of like the greater good and for society and like social contract theory. And this like post-conventional morality is a very like tricky, like more complex system than this conventional and pre-conventional. I feel like those two are like a lot simpler kind of overall to just kind of deal with. I always think like the best way to think about this is like with examples, but yeah, go ahead, Azaii. Sorry. I can tell you have so much thoughts on this.
No, I'm definitely not going down like any, like you said, any murky waters, because that's part of what makes post-conventional morality tricky, right? Because inherently like you're stepping away from like what's considered acceptable, what's considered like what is legal, etc. In this like pursuit of greater morality. But like, if you think about it, right, hopefully it makes sense now why some people are at different stages for different things, but also why some people just don't make it past other stages. Because there's a lot of, like you were saying, there's consequences to moving forward in each stage, right? So that first pre-conventional stage, it's a lot of self-interest at the end of the day. So by moving to the next stage, right, that conventional stage, you're losing some of that self-gain. Right. And then in that second stage, conventional, like you're really just moving towards a stable society, right? Like doing like just status quo, like keeping things as they are. And so that's the benefit there. So you've lost, some of that self-interest, but you've gained stable society. But then in the next one, like you're losing both the stable component of society, because like you said, like you feel like that social contract isn't being maintained. So you've lost some of the stability. You're going against, like that. But like you also, there are cases where like you're not even getting any benefit either, right? So you're doing these things that are going against multiple other levels, right? So, but then people are deciding, okay, is this right or wrong? And like you said, like laws take so much longer to change, right? Like we are constantly, as a society on so many fronts, we're constantly catching up to like what we now consider is right or what we consider is acceptable. And like, it's just this constant game, right, for better, for worse. And actually, I think a lot of this gets capitalized in like the media, because this is the kind of stuff that gets people attention. Like if they wrote like a news piece about how like someone stole, went to a pharmacy and stole all of their antivirals, right, to like help someone else, like that would draw so many people. Like, it's this very story of like Robin Hood, right? Mm-hmm. And like that draws people in for a reason, because it's this, like we're constantly grappling with like, okay, what is right? Like it fosters discussion. It fosters, contemplation of like, what are we willing to put up with and what aren't we willing to put up with? So I was very excited for this topic, just because it's something that, even if it's like many of the topics I think we've discussed in the Psych Social outline, even if we don't think about them on a regular basis, we're constantly interacting with them and living through them on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think like this is something that I think about like every once in a while. Like somebody will say something and like, that's a conventional morality argument. And like that kind of comes out kind of judgy, but like in my mind, it was kind of judgy. Like why, like you'll hear people say that, like I wouldn't do drugs because it's against the law. And I'm like, all right, well, like that's a conventional argument, right? And now I'm coming across like a pro-drug sort of thing, which isn't necessarily the case, but like identifying those arguments of like, do you think it's actually like bad, or do you just think it's bad because the law says it's bad, right? Because there are things that are bad that are not illegal, right? Like there are certain things out there that which is like, this is legal to do, but like, I don't think it's okay to do. But people in those conventional like moralities, like will be able to take advantage of those loopholes, right? And like, kind of get around things and like maybe get away with not paying as many taxes and kind of like things like that, versus someone in that like post-conventional morality might say like, no, like, I have a lot of benefits from society. It's my job to uphold my side, to pay taxes, to help support the system, and that sort of thing. And so it's a really interesting thing that when you look at like tax stuff, there's actually, it's almost like a tax on morality. Overall, like normally as a society, we want to tax stuff that we want to stop, like taxing cigarettes. And so we want like people to quit smoking. And so we tax stuff if we want people to do it less often. But in a way, there's like a tax on morality, with just kind of the way that the system is set up, and the other people who are willing to game the system and take advantage of loopholes and stuff like that, they get rewarded for that. And it's just kind of an interesting thing kind of overall. But like I said earlier, I think examples are always like really key for this. And so this is the example I always like to give to students. Like, let's say that you are in a scenario where you have no money, and like there's not any way to like convince anyone to be on your side. You can't convince anyone of anything. Like, let's say you walk past a kid who is starving, and you see a store that is selling bread, right? And the guy turns his back and he won't just give you the bread, but he turns his back, and that you can steal that bread if you want to, and you would get away with it without repercussions. And so asking like, okay, what is someone in each of these stages going to do? Like somebody who is pre-conventional versus conventional versus post-conventional, like how would they deal with this scenario? So I'm gonna flip that on you, Azaii. Well, like real world scenario here.
Yeah. So I've noticed we've been doing this a lot recently. But yeah, so someone who's pre-conventional, right? They want to know what they can get out of it. They're not even going to consider stealing the bread because they're not going to get anything out of it, right? Like if they're thinking about, okay, well, let me back up. If you're thinking about it from the perspective of doing it for the child, which is where my went, right? They're not going to steal it for the child, to be very clear. So they might steal it if they want to for themselves, but I'm going about this perspective, I'm going about this example strictly like for what we would do for the child, which probably says something about like,
it probably says something about what you're focused on. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Don't read too much into me about that. But, right. So then someone who's conventional is going to have a different argument for not stealing for the child, right? It's not that I don't get anything out of it. It's that it's against the law. And then someone who's post-conventional is going to say, okay, well, yeah, I don't get anything out of it, right? Yeah, it's against the law, but this child is hungry and it's wrong for me to walk past this child and not do something about it. And since I have no legal recourse to do something about it, then it's okay to steal it from someone who clearly has, and then give it to this child who's vulnerable and unable to do for themselves. Now, if we go back from the perspective of just like what they might do in general, we can do that too, but that's a different set of.
That's why I love this. Like, it didn't even occur to you to like just steal it for yourself. Right?
No, because I saw your face. I was like, oh, I know where he's going with this.
Yeah, because that's totally a pre-conventional thought process of like, I know I can get away with this. I'm just going to steal it and I'm going to have some bread.
Yeah.
And so like it's this kind of like interesting scenario that I like to create here, because like what's going to happen in terms of stealing is actually the same in the post and the pre-conventional. They're both going to steal it. It's the conventional that doesn't steal, but it's like the reasons behind it are interesting, right? And so I think that like a trickier question that the MCAT could ask is somewhere when like multiple layers line up, like something like everyone is going to do this, the pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional are all going to do this behavior, but they could ask you about the motivations and ask you for identifying that. Like, for example, if they say like Bob, like doesn't steal because he doesn't want to go to jail. What kind of morality is that? And that's kind of a tricky one as well, kind of a leveled up question that I could see the MCAT asking. So specifically, he's not stealing because he doesn't want to go to jail. And so where would that fit in?
So that's conventional. It goes against the law. He doesn't want to break the law.
Yeah. I can see that might even be pre-conventional because it's like a benefit. Punishment. Yeah, of just trying to avoid this punishment. Now, if he's like, if Bob doesn't steal because he doesn't break the law, that would be more conventional versus like, I don't steal because I don't want to go to jail. That's like a self-interest sort of thing. And so that's like, even though they're still following the laws, they're not following the laws because of the laws, they're following the laws because of fear of punishment or those sorts of things. Like if the law changed of like, oh, if you steal a TV, then you have to do 10 jumping jacks, right? Like Bob would steal the TV in that scenario. And like, it doesn't even matter what the law is, like just because it's good for me, the benefit overall. And so it's just kind of like there can be very tricky questions built around this and focusing on like, because of fear of punishment, like that makes it a pre-conventional versus like, oh, I just follow the laws and I do what society says. Like that's more conventional versus higher order morality and social contract theory and some like really complex stuff is that like more post-conventional morality overall.
And some of the examples that we've used have been like pretty big in their consequences and whatnot, but this can also apply to like very small things. Right? Like, you know, someone in the store gives you the wrong change and they gave you too much change. Like, what are you going to do about it? Right? In comparison to like I think the example you mentioned earlier, like not killing someone because it's against the law, right? Like those are two very opposite ends of the spectrum, but you can apply this reasoning to basically any situation that has some moral component. And like, as you probably noticed and picked up on, based on how you phrase it, like makes all the difference in terms of what the argument is or why like someone may or may not do something. And so that's also why presenting, like how you present a problem is so important in the outcome of like how people decide to respond to it.
Yeah, that like don't jump too quick to just like, oh, it's this scenario, so it's always this. Like always look into the reasoning for those. And like think, like you said, they can get really small. It doesn't even have to be like stealing or things like that. It could be something about like, you know, somebody lent you a pencil, right? What do? Do you give the pencil back? Do you keep the pencil? Like what's going on there? And what's really interesting, say that again.
Most doctors will keep the pencil.
Yeah. Pens are very valuable. There's never enough. Yeah. And so like, there's kind of interesting, like imagining like as a kid in school, like somebody gives you a pencil, but it's a kid that nobody likes. And like everyone around you is always like picking on this person and taking advantage of this person. And that's just the norm in this little culture that you live in, like within your like class and grade and all of that stuff, is that this is person that you're supposed to take advantage of. And like, I know this is like a horrible, like scary thing, but in that scenario, like you might argue that a conventional morality is to keep the pencil or keep the pen and not give it back, because that's what society, your little culture is saying. And so there's like some interesting things kind of going on there of like based on how a social group is being presented, right? Like if I didn't give you that clarification, if I asked like, you know, you borrow a pencil from somebody, according to conventional morality, what should you do? And like the answer is probably give the pencil back, because that's probably what the rules are going to be and probably what how society is going to view that. But like if they can like throw some wrenches in there and throw some like confusing twists in there to make it a little bit more complex. And so I think that a lot of times at first, this seems like something really obvious, but then like the way the question is phrased and the scenario, the way it's presented, like it throws a wrench and tries to push it into like a different section. And so I think especially when you see like these like Kohlberg morality stages presented on the MCAT, if you see a question on it, like I think you should like very much like take a second, because they're probably trying to push you into something that normally you wouldn't think. Like the example of like Bob doesn't steal because he doesn't want to go to jail. Like that's pre-conventional. And that's like a kind of a tricky sort of scenario. And so just keeping your eyes peeled on that, because like the MCAT likes to be tricky with these, and it's very easy to get tricky. But it's also, I think, just a good thing to think about of like understanding like, why do I act the way I do this? That's kind of a throwback to like the last 2 weeks about behavior, but just understanding like morality and what do you think is the right thing to do in a scenario. And like, you might stop and think, okay, what kind of reasoning is that? Right. Because you might find yourself being like, that was a very pre-conventional thought process of like, oh, somebody, like I saw somebody dropped like the answers to the test and you found them, and like maybe like what do you do in that scenario, right? And like that's kind of an interesting thing of like a little bit of a tricky scenario in the real world. I know in the real world some people are going to be like, I'm going to use them, right? And that's a very pre-conventional morality based on that. Now, you could also say like those people might think, just to like make this, you know, a very complex scenario, turn up the difficulty. Maybe this person really believes they'll be a great physician and they just need to get through this so they can help so many people, right? And so they take the answers in order to do well on the test in order to help people. And so in a way, that's actually kind of a post-conventional morality, because they're breaking the rules, but for the greater good as the question is presented, as the scenario is presented. And so it's like a really interesting thing that the way it's worded makes a whole lot of difference. And kind of like, what's their thought process? Do they just like want to take advantage of the scenario so they don't have to study this weekend? Are they doing it because they want to, you know, be a doctor and like do cataract surgeries and like, you know, under undeveloped nations? Or like, are they going to turn it in just because that's what the rules say you're supposed to do? Or do you turn it in because that's the right thing to do? And like that, what's interesting is the way the question is worded. There's multiple answers here that could even be like the post-conventional morality.
Yeah. And I was like, on the flip side of that, like you were saying, something that seems pre-conventional that is actually post-conventional, like something that seems post-conventional is actually pre-conventional. Like the student turns it in, not because it's like the right thing to do, not because it's like the rules, but because they don't want the teacher to find out and make a more difficult version of the test. Like it's pre-conventional because they're trying to avoid like something that's very bad for them, which is having to redo a harder version of the test.
Or they're just afraid they'll get caught and like get punished. Yeah.
Exactly. So like there are so many, there are infinite, darn near infinite variations of this. But it's just some stuff to think about. We enjoy having these conversations and getting to cover these topics with you guys, because not only do you need to know it for the MCAT and to succeed on this and eventually be doctors, but also because some of the stuff is just really interesting. So if you want to have a conversation over, you know, this upcoming holiday break about morality, see where that goes. I'm very curious to find out.